Welcome to all and bienvenue. Pour la traduction en français, veuillez cliquer s'il vous plaît sur le petit globe en bas de l'écran. Merci. And now back to English. We also have live captioning, and the link to access that will be posted in the chat as well. And so yeah, let's start. Welcome to today's session, Feminist Pathways to a Climate Just Future. I am Elisa de Siqueira and work as Humanitarian Advocacy Officer on the climate crisis at Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, here in Berlin. And I am very, very glad to welcome today three marvelous experts on this panel. First of all, Maria Reyes, a full-time climate and human rights activist at Fridays for Future MAPA, which stands for Most Affected Peoples and Areas. She's also a leading member of the Feminist Action for Climate Justice Coalition of the UN Women Generation Equality Forum. Welcome, Maria. Our second speaker today, Dr. Asha Mohammed. You can turn on your video now if you want so that the people can see you. Dr. Asha Mohammed is currently the Secretary General of the Kenya Red Cross Society. She's a dentist and public health practitioner by profession. Welcome, Dr. Asha. Dr. Heather McMullen, welcome to you too. You are a social scientist at the Center for Public Health and Policy at the Wolfson Institute of Population Health and a professor at the Queen Mary University in London. Welcome. Well, now, before I open the stage for our honored guests to speak, I will have to say a few administrative things first. So first of all, we will be recording this session, and then you can use the Q&A for questions. And if there's any technical problem or general comment to the speakers or myself, please write us a message in the chat. If you want to use Twitter, please use the hashtag HCBerlin and follow the Congress on Twitter at HumConBerlin. And then the last administrative notice, we will be using Mentimeter for some survey at 2 moments during the session, and just to follow the link that will be posted in the chat. So just to see how this Mentimeter works, I will start with a general question for the audience. So my first question, to all of you would be, what are the first things that come to your mind on feminist climate justice? And the chat for the Mentimeter has been posted in the chat right now, and I will give you a little time to respond to that question. And during the time you respond, I will tell you a little bit about what inspires me on this topic. So Vanessa Nakate, a Ugandan Fridays for Future activist and founder of the African Rise Up movement, said in an interview with UN Women in March this year, "You can't have climate justice without gender equality." This is what our session will be about, partly because climate feminism is not only about gender equality. The climate crisis is an intersectional issue, and it hits the most vulnerable the hardest. In less than a month, we will have the COP27 in Egypt, where the Gender Action Plan will be discussed. But gender mainstreaming is still not happening in the negotiations in general. Feminist climate justice includes, for us, gender equality for all, including non-binary genders. It includes the respect of indigenous people's rights, the respect of disabled people's rights. It is anti-racist and considers an active role for these and other marginalized groups. Well, yes, the climate crisis is closely linked to race, class, and gender inequalities, but unfortunately, a profound structural analysis linking all these aspects is still lacking in humanitarian action. There is evidence that women and men suffer different negative impacts following extreme weather events such as floods, storms, and heat waves. But I will stop here because we will be hearing more about this from our panelists. I am personally looking very, very much forward to this discussion on how a feminist approach, especially in humanitarian settings, can be a response to multiple and overlapping crises and provide for a climate just future. So before I give the floor to our panelists, I want to see what came up in our Mentimeter poll. Can we have a look at it? Oh, there it is. The most important word seems to be intersectionality. That is exactly what we will be talking today. And yes, reducing gender equality, equality in general, having an anti-racist approach, we need participation, we need to have this in an anti-colonial, interdisciplinary manner. It has to be inclusive. Yes, all of these things, I think, will be something we will come up or come back to during our panel discussion. Pink and greenwashing is an interesting one as well. Well, thank you very much, Lina, for sharing. I think we will have a look, if we have some time in the end of the session again, to see if some of these aspects came up during our statements that we will be hearing from our panelists. So, now let's turn to our speakers and see what they would respond to a similar question. That is, why is it important to have an intersectional feminist approach while tackling the climate crisis in humanitarian settings? Maria, please go on.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for the invitation, the opportunity to speak to you. I would like to start by sharing that I ended up involved in climate activism through the feminist movement, more specifically through ecofeminism. To give you some context, Mexico is the most dangerous country in America to be a woman, and one of the most dangerous in the world. Every day, around 11 women are murdered for gender-related causes, becoming victims of femicide. This includes children, young women, elder women, trans women from all contexts, social classes, and regions. In addition to this, 8 out of 10 women in Mexico have suffered some kind of gender violence in their lives, whether it's physical, sexual, emotional, or economic. I grew up in this context, suffering sexual harassment in the public transport or walking in the street, and crying in the school restaurants with my friends almost every morning because we had been attacked on our way to school again. So it's well said that each one of us becomes a feminist because of our own stories. I feel like these experiences since I was a child brought me closer to feminism and taught me skills and strategies to survive in this context. In this path, I got to understand how under the patriarchal system we live on, women and people socialized as women are used to performing certain roles and fulfilling certain expectations. One of them is the use of our bodies as tools for profit and pleasure. If we look at our story in Latin America, when colonizers arrived, they would kidnap, rape, and enslave Native women, later using them for their purposes. In a parallel way, they took over the land, the water, the animals, the plants, and all elements in nature they could profit from. Historically, both women and the land have been treated as territories for conquest. To this day, this hasn't changed much. So when it comes to the climate crisis, we can see how the disproportional effects over women have been present since the very origin of the crisis. Being oppressed by the same systemic structures that have caused the destruction of ecosystems and have polluted our atmosphere, such as capitalism, imperialism, colonization, and extractivism, where the logics of patriarchy have been complicit, since most of the systems have been ruled by men, especially cis men, white men, rich men, and men from the global north. Today, due to the socially assigned practices that women perform, women and people socialized as women are more impacted when climate calamities hit communities. Let me explain this with the example of water scarcity. In Latin American cultures, women are usually assigned roles like preparing food, cleaning the house, taking care of elder and sick relatives, as well as children. All of these activities require close contact with water. For this reason, women realize first when the availability of water is decreasing, whether it's in domestic tanks or community wells. And therefore, they are the first affected by water scarcity, as it makes it difficult for them to carry out their activities. And that makes them more vulnerable to suffer gender violence inside their houses, inside their families. In addition to this, water scarcity affects dignified menstruations since it complicates adequate sanitation. and the lack of access to clean water is a threat to our health. I myself have been sick during the last 2 years for drinking polluted water. However, women are not only victims of climate injustice. We are powerful actors of change, especially women from rural and indigenous communities who hold the ancestral knowledge on how to collaborate with nature in a reciprocal and respectful way, and are currently organizing their communities to preserve and share that knowledge. And this is why having a feminist approach to climate action is needed. And that doesn't translate only on having more women in positions of power. That doesn't translate into having more women into green jobs. That translates into a total restructuration of our system. Because under a feminist lens, we need to dismantle patriarchy, like on each one of the levels of our lives. And we need to start with our smallest circles. And then we need to start with societies. And then we need to start with politicians. And then overall, a feminist approach to climate action is something that puts human rights, puts everyone's rights at the front line before profit. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Maria, for sharing your story, for showing us that women are not only victims, but also actors for change, and also reminding us that, yeah, feminist approach needs to put human rights in the center of it. So thanks very much. And also, I thought your example of the water scarcity and how difficult access to water for women can be, I thought it was really interesting. And I would like to pass over for a next statement to Dr. Asha Mohammed, because I think maybe you can give us insight into your work as well, where you might see other effects on a feminist approach for climate justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eliza, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this important discussion. I think Maria has touched on a lot of issues that maybe I would have also talked about, but I'll try maybe not to repeat too much. First, I just want to acknowledge that the climate crisis will affect everyone. It will affect every country, it will affect every continent, and it will affect every gender, as we have already seen. But I think, as has been said many times, women and girls are disproportionately affected. And this is a fact, and it will get worse if nothing is done. So I think from that perspective, then we definitely see how our actions are really going to be then sensitive to this scenario. I will talk about maybe using Africa more than any other contexts, because that's the context I know best. And start by saying that women make up 50% of the population on the continent, and in Kenya, it is the same proportion that we see. It is these same women that are responsible for a lot of the food production that takes place, especially in the rural areas. They are the subsistent farmers, but they are also the ones who are taking care of the family in terms of health. So they are the health caregivers. When now, for example, we have drought and there's no water in the household, it is the same women then that have to trek long distances to go and actually fetch water. As Maria mentioned, of course, when there is scarcity of water, then in terms of their own hygiene and healthcare, then we know this is grossly affected. It is the same girls who have to drop out of school to be able to support the family, to care for the young ones and the elderly. And therefore, when a crisis happens, they are the ones who have to bear the biggest brunt of that crisis. While, of course, fetching water and trekking long distances, women are exposed to a lot of dangers, sexual and gender-based violence along the way as they trek many kilometers to go and look for water. It is the same girls who have to leave school to go and get married because the family has lost all sorts of livelihood, and therefore the girl is the one that can then, you can say, can be used then to replenish, for example, the assets and the livelihood of the family. So I think whichever way you look at it, women and girls are in the center of the climate crisis, and they are the ones who are affected most. But I think, as Maria also said, women are not just the victims in this case, but also can make the difference. And that is why it is so important to ensure that they are included in all levels and sectors of our humanitarian response, for them to be able to actually contribute in a meaningful and effective way, because they also know where it pinches most, and they will be able then to contribute to the effective solutions. Women also as caregivers, nurturing children. I think when we talk about the climate crisis, clearly this is an issue that will affect many generations, and I think women then are in a good place to be able to ensure that families and communities are well placed and well sensitized to be able to act to prevent further deterioration of their situation, if they understand well exactly what role they can play as far as the climate crisis is concerned. So in my view then, I think it will be a defeatist way of us looking at the climate crisis without then taking a feminist approach, because whichever way we look at it, women are central in finding the solutions. Women are central in the adaptation process, and therefore must be included in all the approaches that we take. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Asha. I really liked how you repeatedly and very unfortunately said that women and girls are really in the center of the climate crisis, and therefore we have to have a feminist approach while tackling the climate crisis in humanitarian contexts. Thank you very much for that. And now maybe having a little bit more academic perspective on how we can have a feminist approach while tackling the climate crisis. So Dr. Heather McMullen, please, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here and a delight to be able to speak about feminist pathways. So what is a feminist pathway comprised of? Feminism has always been concerned with the body, and feminist struggle has time and time again made clear the importance of the body as a site of contestation, of power relations, of oppression, of life force, of struggle, of injustice. And so the body has been central to feminist struggle and to the rights and freedoms feminists have achieved. The right to choose if, when, and how many children to have, to choose when or if to have sex, to marry or not, to be free from violence, to wear what we like, to be in physically safe spaces. I mean, the list continues. So for me and the work I do, it's clear that a feminist pathway must be concerned with sexual and reproductive health, rights, and justice. There's no justice without bodily autonomy and integrity, and there's no climate justice without this either. If people don't have control over their bodies, they can't take control over their lives, they can't respond and react, they can't participate, challenge, enjoy health and well-being, be active in public life and onwards. And the challenges brought on by the climate crisis makes this need only more acute. When there's high heat, floods, droughts, disasters, and crisis, if we don't consider how to ensure sexual and reproductive rights, health, and justice, we are no doubt leaving people behind and not supporting those facing multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination. Responding, adapting, and becoming resilient to climate change requires upholding human rights, including sexual and reproductive health, rights, and justice. And in my view, this is a really essential component of any feminist pathway to climate justice. Because sexual and reproductive rights and health interacts with some of the most fundamental and intimate aspects of our lives, but also some of the most stigmatized and controversial, it's often deprioritized and left out of important policy discussions, funding allocations, and more. The climate space has not paid enough attention to the importance of sexual reproductive rights, health, and justice in building climate adaptation and resilience, and evidence demonstrates how climate change negatively impacts a number of these domains. Can I have the first slide, please? So we're seeing evidence demonstrating how climate change negatively impacts a number of different domains, but there's increasing evidence on the impacts on pregnancy and maternal health outcomes. And you can see some of that on that slide here. So we're seeing increases in air pollution and heat, leading to preterm birth, preeclampsia, and other issues. But we also see how this interacts with less direct pathways through disruption to services, lack of access, and erosion to other forms of health support. And these impacts are not neutral. These impacts call on multiple and existing forms of discrimination, really highlighting why an intersectional approach is critical. Data in the US shows how this impact on pregnancy and maternal health outcomes is hitting mothers of African descent harder due to environmental racism and other structural forms of oppression. And this is an acute example of the need for reproductive justice, but also intersectional approaches. In humanitarian settings, we see compounding forms of harm where the ongoing challenges of slow onset forms of climate change come together with extreme weather events and other disasters, really hurting those with the least access to power and resources the most. Sexual and gender-based violence increases during humanitarian crises, as does food and water scarcity and child marriage. And people lose access to HIV medication, to emergency obstetric care, to STI treatment, and more. We also see a poor consideration of diversity and compounding vulnerabilities, so people with diverse sexual orientations, gender identities, and expressions can be inadequately considered in disaster planning and provision. Elderly women, people with disabilities, and others who may need particular forms of support are too often left behind. So a feminist response and a feminist pathway takes all of this into account. Next slide, please. But good things are happening too. We're seeing increased recognition of frameworks that help us think about intersectionality, justice, and power. And I encourage us all to learn from frameworks such as the reproductive justice movement, which challenges some elements of the mainstream sexual and reproductive rights and health movement, and encourages us to think not only about choice, but also access and the structural drivers of oppression and how these come together to create particular social realities for people. And this framework was developed and based on the experience of racialized women. Combined with the environmental justice and climate justice frameworks, we can develop a better analysis of how reproductive justice, racial justice, and climate justice all depend on each other. Multiple data demonstrates, for example, how people of African descent are hit harder by both climate and environmental crises, which are of course not experienced separately at the community level. Increasing participation, meaningful engagement, and participatory approaches, including within research, make it more likely for programs, data, policy, and onwards to represent those closest to the challenges best. While the scientific evidence is growing on interactions between gender, sexual and reproductive rights, and health and climate change, we do need to consider these in dialogue with these emerging analyses, innovations, and thought leadership emerging from those with lived experiences and that combine aspects of social theory, traditional knowledge production, and more to give us an even better analysis than we can get from science alone. But another important element of the feminist pathway is solidarity, empowerment, and action. And women and girls are leading innovative solutions to the climate crisis at multiple levels. The feminist movement is active in the climate space at the grassroots level, but also in the formal proceedings. And I would encourage you to take a look at the Gender Just Climate Solutions Compendium put together by the Women and Gender constituency of the UNFCCC each year, which I'll link in the chat, where you can see examples of collectives organizing for land rights, for more responsive agricultural programming, for programmatic approaches that include aspects of sexual and reproductive rights and health, and for more exciting and responsive feminist approaches developed by those closest to the challenges. So to summarize, we're seeing progress on understanding linkages between sexual and reproductive rights and health and climate change, which is essential for considering the feminist pathway. Bodily autonomy and upholding SRHR are essential for resilience and adaptation and for justice, and important frameworks that better capture the complexity of what's happening are gaining ground. Women and girls are innovating on the front lines. We can take inspiration from this and amplify it, keeping in mind our feminist principles for a more just future. Thanks.
Thank you so much for bringing you in this really big picture on this interlinkages, and really already bringing in some solutions and some hope for the future, maybe. So thank you very much. And since you were talking about solutions, I was thinking that maybe I could ask Dr. Asha, because now we will be starting to get into the discussion. So Dr. Asha, may I ask you, what do you think? What can humanitarian actors contribute to adopt a more feminist lens in the context of climate crisis, after all the statements you heard, and also bringing in maybe some project experience from the ground? Thank you.
Yeah. No, thank you. And I think first and foremost, I always say it's first about recognizing the issue and accepting that there is an issue to address, because that is always the challenge when we are not first and foremost agreeing and clear that this is the problem we have to deal with. So as the humanitarians, I think we are clearly today, I would say, in agreement that women and girls are the most affected when we have crisis. And therefore it means that we have to first and foremost ensure that our approaches are gender sensitive in that sense. And more importantly, I think it's also the question of inclusion and of the participation of women, especially at the decision-making level. Because again, if you look at a lot of the responses, women will be most likely the ones queuing up to get the support that's being given, whether in terms of in-kind food or whatever else is being given. But when it comes to the discussions about how some of these things should be done or what is needed, then they will not be in the group that will be making the decision. So this is one way, I would say, even for us as an organization, we have taken very deliberate efforts to ensure that we actually look at this and be very conscious about it. And also in terms of the tools that we use, because even when we collect the data, for us then to be able actually to justify why we are saying this is the case, then we also have to ensure that our tools are very responsive and are able to pick actually all this information that can then be used in terms of advocating, but also the question of resource allocation. So working closely again with women, community-based organizations to ensure that they are fully included in terms of the action. So I think it comes from the whole framework of how we design these approaches to the actual inclusion and participation of women in terms of, I would say, not just climate crisis, but in terms of humanitarian crisis in general. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And as you saw or heard, we already started to get into the discussion, and I have a lot of questions for our panelists. But if you have some questions from the audience as well, please feel free to send them in the Q&A. I saw that there is already one question that arrived. I have just a follow-up question to what Dr. Asha said for Maria, actually. And after that, I will come back to the questions from the audience. So please feel free to interact and ask our panelists. Maria, so after what Dr. Asha said about we need to have more women in decision-making, I realized that a lot of Fridays for Futures in a lot of countries are mostly led by women. So if you look at Vanessa Nakata, we look at Greta, here in Germany, it's Luisa Neubauer. They are led by young women, and what do you think? Do women care more, or why is it that it's so many young women getting in this fight? And yeah, why is it important that the younger generation also fights for climate justice? Yeah, it was a little bit like 3 questions in one, but I'm sure you can respond to it. Thank you.
Yeah, this is a difficult question because I feel like saying women care more, it can be controversial, even though I might agree. I don't know if we care more, but we're definitely affected more. And when an issue hits you personally, and it hits personally people you care and love, that really mobilizes you to do something. You know, feeling pain, feeling frustration and anxiety because my body hurt from being sick as a result of drinking polluted water, that really wakes up a rage inside you that it's unprecedented, especially when you understand that the reason why you're feeling like that, it's connected to companies spilling their waste in the local rivers, and companies trying to save money to not carry out the due processes to clean the water, and how that is connected to the same companies are the ones who own the automotive industry in the region, which is actually Volkswagen, is German. So that really hits you different. You know, when you find yourself in an hospital room being like, you might have to be medicated for like the rest of your life because of this. And when you understand that that's connected to what's destroying our planet and killing people who are on the front line, that really hits different. And it hits even more different when you see people you care about being evicted from their territories. I work a lot with, I don't like to say work, but like I fight with indigenous peoples in Mexico as part of the Indigenous Futures Network. And they are people I love, they are people I care about, they're my friends, they're like family for me. And when you see them being evicted from their territories, when you see them being threatened, when you see them being criminalized, that really hits different. And also most of them are women. So I don't know if we care more, but we're definitely affected more. And when something is affecting you directly, there's a rage and there's this unstoppable energy that's I visualize it like a fire inside my chest that it just makes you do something. I don't know, I don't think it's on purpose that women or people socialized as women are the ones who are leading these fights. I think it's not because we as women got together and said, oh, let's be at the forefront of this. It's because there is the fight. This fight is a result of, it comes out of need, comes out of purpose, comes out of rage and necessity. It's also not a coincidence that if you look at the revolutionary movement that in Chile that led to having a new constitution, it was teenage girls, college girls leading those protests. If you look at what's happening in Iran, in Kurdistan, in Balochistan right now, it's teenage girls leading those protests.
Yeah, totally. And I thought, you're totally right. But I actually thought on one question, on one point that you talked about, especially also the women's roles in indigenous peoples groups and in regards to their rights. And I thought it was quite interesting. Oh, I just remembered what Heather McMullen told us about what the gender constituency is also fighting for right now, right? For the allocation of land rights. And I guess indigenous peoples are a big part of this constituency as well, especially regarding land rights. And I have one question from the chat actually that I thought was aligned with that. So Heather, could you, I mean, you did already say a few practical examples, but still, could you give some more practical examples maybe of effective tools to implement a feminist approach to climate action?
Sure, I can try. I'd love to hear also from the other panelists about this too. But I think it sounds insufficient to say, but I think one of the most important things is having the right people around the table and in the right spaces. So I do think that we do need more representation of people who are closest to the impacts of the climate crisis, and that that needs to be meaningful representation and engagement, sort of not sort of box ticking. And that's certainly something that we could do a lot better at, but it also really isn't sufficient. Some other things that I thought of, maybe in part because I'm working in an academic space, is increasing participatory approaches and also, really having research be sort of determined and led by people in local communities. I really believe with this phrase that the people closest to the problems are closest to the solutions. And I don't think that we really take that on board enough in this space. And a lot of research, for example, is quite top down in its determination, and co-creation and working with local communities about what actually needs to be addressed, I think, is a feminist approach. And that includes different forms of knowledge as well. So feminism has always been good at recognizing knowledge outside of, for example, the sort of a positivist ontological frame, and actually thinking and using different multiple ways of understanding and experiencing a lot of what actually Maria was just describing as valid forms of knowledge production and of evidence. So we could certainly do more on that. And related to that, within the programmatic space, I think there's increased role for social accountability programs. So where people are actually determining and then evaluating the priorities that are relevant for them, and then working towards implementation. But organizations often go in with a preset program when really there's a lot of mechanisms and formulas out there of how to actually have that be more prioritized and responsive to local communities. But there's so many more examples. Those are the ones that just came up the top of my head. I think we did manage to link some of the gender just climate solutions, where you can also look at some of the really innovative ways that people all over have been strategizing. But I also would love to hear from others. But those are a few of my first thoughts to that helpful question.
Thanks a lot. I also think it's really helpful to get a more concrete response to what we all are questioning ourselves. So maybe Dr. Asha, if I may ask you if you can think of some practical examples. And then also there was another question coming here, which also links this question on the practical examples to if there might be any particularities of taking a feminist climate justice approach in the humanitarian system. So it's a little bit a more critical question. Dr. Asha, do you want to respond maybe?
Thank you. I think a lot has already been said by my colleagues, but maybe what I can also, again, include is that in terms of our approaches, one of the things that we are sensitive about is that when we need to prioritize, then we would prioritize the female-headed households, households with children under 5, but also pregnant and lactating women. So in a way, then being very, you can say, very conscious about ensuring that actually those that are affected most, and this, like we said, are then women, get to be supported, you can say, first. Secondly, is also the question of there's the humanitarian action when a crisis hits, but more importantly, there is also the question of building resilience to ensure that communities can be able to withstand some of the shocks that come through with the different hazards. And there again, working very closely with women in communities, but also women-led groups to build their resilience to some of these issues. I'll give an example, like today with the drought, we have been able to support women groups to have a savings and loan system where they are able to then start alternative businesses. Because then, of course, the traditional ways of getting income are being eroded because of the many crises, and not only the drought, but we've had also the question of COVID as well. that has come to complicate already a bad situation. Again, key for me is really about including them in decision making. An example that I can also share is that we support communities to form community-based disaster risk reduction committees, and in this then ensure that women are also part of these committees and can actually engage in decision making in a very structured way, so that it's not sort of like a by chance issue, but that it is very concrete and very deliberate to ensure that they are also included in all these different structures. So I think those are probably some of the ones I would want to share. And again, I still go back to the question of how we capture these issues, because it becomes, sometimes a difficult subject where, it could be seen as, well, we're just talking about women all the time and, they are the most affected. But I think we need more and more to actually bring out this data so that people can actually appreciate the magnitude of what we are saying. So ensuring them that all our tools are able to capture this in a very, you can say, professional way for people to actually be able to see and accept that there is need to maybe change sometimes the way we respond to some of this crisis. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Yes, really interesting. Maria, do you want to come in on this, on the practical examples of how to have a feminist approach really in climate action? And maybe, because I know you have some experience also in humanitarian settings, so maybe if you want to talk about the particularities as well that you see.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like something that we forget a lot when we have this conversation, it's all the women and people socialized as women that are climate refugees, and not only for being impacted by climate calamities, but also because they have to evacuate as a result of being criminalized and threatened because of fighting the structural causes of climate change. And so I really think a lot about Afghanistan, and I feel like the world has forgotten Afghanistan, but it's very much a living crisis still. There's still lots of women that are there, not only women, just people, children, elder relatives that are stuck in there under this, massive oppression from the Taliban. And we really forget that before or even during this moments of oppression, they were already very affected by climate change, by the climate crisis. And it's also so interesting, like I in this international platform of climate activism, every time I talk with like my friends, people I work with, everyone in impacted communities has experienced water scarcity. Really, water scarcity, has been something that has brought us together. It's one of the main and first impacts of the climate crisis. And that was a reality in Afghanistan before the Taliban hit. And people were already in conditions to evacuate because of the climate calamities and the droughts and the water scarcity. And this situation hasn't got any better with what's happening currently. And the same is happening in Iran. And the same is happening in Kurdistan, and the same is happening in Balochistan. And all these people are not just refugees, they're also climate refugees. In Latin America, 3 years ago, we had this large caravan of migrants coming from South America, and most of them were women. And on the way to be traveling from one place to the other, which is not an easy decision, leaving your whole life behind and the land where you grow up in, it's a very, very, very hard decision to make, a very hurtful decision. And they take the decision of taking their children, carrying them, walking all the way until Mexico and try to get into the United States maybe. And they are victims of sexual threats, sexual harassment, gender violence on the way. Most of them are women. And so when governments take actions, or even with this very popular feminist foreign policies now, they don't think about them. So I really invite you also that, you know, when we have these conversations about feminism, climate change, let's think about all the women that are evicted from their territories and that have to migrate and that are refugees now, and the conditions they're living on. And really, especially the German government, demand humanitarian programs from them, because they really have the power to do that.
Totally. And I think really the subject of climate migration and displacement is something that is also lacking bigger analyses and is not really present in the COP negotiations either, right? So I think it's a really important topic too. And well, now I want to go on to another topic for our discussion, talking of COP, an event that will take place in less than a month now in Egypt, first time on the African continent, not the first time, but it is really important that it is on the African continent, sorry. And so I will ask the panelists later to share their expectations on the outcomes and also their basic demands for the COP negotiators. But before I will give back the microphone to our speakers, I want to ask again our audience, what do you think are the most important issues for COP27? And there's again a link for Mentimeter in the chat. And please feel free to write whatever you think are important issues for COP. And while everyone is typing this response in, I will have a look at my speakers to see who does want to start with a short statement on the demands and the expected outcomes for COP27. Maybe Dr. Asha, do you want to start?
Okay, thanks. Elisa, we have been in many meetings. We have been in many conferences. I had the opportunity to attend the last COP26. Long days, many people, lots of discussions, lots of pledges, a lot of outcome. 1 year later, going to Egypt for COP27, we really can't feel these commitments having been fulfilled. Maybe yes, some of it is long-term, but we should have seen some good progress. We are not seeing that. We made commitments before in terms of, for example, localization and supporting local actors. I think we've been tested this time from the time of COVID and now with all the other crises that are happening, but we see less and less support going to local actors. So I would say I'm a little bit pessimistic, if I must say, that we are discussing, talking a lot, making commitments, but very little action is actually happening. And so my expectation then of COP27 and the fact that it's actually going to happen in Africa, I hope will be a good point to actually drive some of the messages that have been put on the table before. And one is the fact that even as we talk about the climate crisis, it is something that is already here with us. We in Africa are living this every day, and we are seeing how communities continue to be affected every day, and the situation is not getting any better. Even in other parts of the world, we have seen the fires, we have seen the flooding, even drought in very unexpected places. So I think we don't need any more discussion or talk about what is the effect, because it is there. But the question is that what are we going to do about it? First and foremost, yes, we have the big issues about reducing the gas emissions, which those responsible for it need to take action. But more critically, we have people who today are affected by this, and they need to be supported to be able to adapt to this. But the resources to be able to do this then need to come out, and they need to be directed to those that really need this support. So I would say for me, I'm just hoping that we will not go back to discussing, what is going on, because that is clear. We have enough reports telling us exactly what is happening. I think hopefully more discussions about how are we going to fulfill these commitments? How are we going to save the people who today are already facing, I would say, some communities I've visited in Kenya who are talking about waiting for them to just disappear from this earth, for them to be extinct.
Yeah.
It is that bad and it's that urgent. And so a lot of talk again is not going to take us anywhere. So I'm really hoping that this time around, I wish we could even just have a few commitments that we can actually deliver on, rather than a whole long list of many commitments that, again, we will still go to COP28 and still talk about the same thing.
Thank you.
Sorry to be a bit...
Well, thank you. Yes, of course, we need more ambition in mitigation. We need a better plan and better financing for adaptation, but also we need to talk about loss and damage, which is the moment when adaptation is not possible anymore. So yeah, you're totally right. Who wants to go next? Heather or Maria? Maybe you have some expectations also regarding the gender action plan, or some gender, or Heather, even some gender and health aspects at COP27. Do you want to go?
Sure, I can go ahead. I have a kind of set of things I would like to see, and that colleagues that I work with would like to see. So we would like to see increased funding and kind of accountability for funding towards adaptation. So I think a lot of the issues that we're talking about today live in the world of adaptation. And certainly when we're talking about sexual and reproductive rights and health, we want to see a focus on adaptation and building resilience. There has historically been some focus on mitigation through reducing fertility and challenging issues around population growth. And most feminist actors really push back on that kind of rationale and see it as a way of a false solution and a way of sort of scapegoating particular groups for the climate crisis. So we want to see increased funding and increased focus and increased effort, but we want to see that also with a critical approach on challenging false solutions, and sort of really in looking at that and not replicating the sort of logics and thinking that actually underpins the climate crisis. So it's not enough, for example, to have evidence. We also need ethics, and we also need critical thinking. So we want to see these increases, but we also want to see a challenge and a pushback on some of the false solutions that are being proposed, and some of which have lived in the realm of sexual and reproductive rights and health at times. So we'd like to see that, and we want that funding to be human rights-based, equitable, transparent. We want flexible funding. People are asking, how do you actually implement feminist tools? How do you support the grassroots? There's actually a lot of barriers around some of the funding that exists to be able to do that in an effective way. And that needs to be looked at and challenged too. Consistent, flexible. These are all things that actually can support people on the front lines. We do want to see increased research and data collection. We want that to look at the differentiated impacts of the climate crisis. We want to see disaggregated data, particularly in relation to groups facing multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination. That's not just women and girls, that's numerous other groups as well who are facing intersectional impacts of the climate crisis. And we want to see more inclusion of sexual and reproductive rights and health, even in our allies, even in the gender space. We want indicators on that. We don't want to assume that always comes along when we're talking about gender, because it doesn't. and there are multiple sort of impacts. And if we don't account for them, and if we don't look for them, then we're not going to be able to document and advocate and onwards. we still need to do a lot of amplification and prioritizing of the voices of the most affected and increasing participation. And that doesn't just mean like giving spaces, that also means training, that also means provision, that also means funding. You know, there's a whole bunch of things that actually come along with the idea of access. And like the reproductive justice movement has been good, for example, at saying, at sort of outlining what some of those things are. Mm-hmm. But we also just really want to see some of the existing commitments met. That would be great. And so actually just, you know, achieving what has already been set out would be really good, and sort of strengthening that. And also the conversation about loss and damage is really important for the aspects that I work on too. The climate and health space, I think, has been a bit slow in this space, and maybe not the best actually at looking at health inequalities so far. But I think that's changing, and I have seen in my years trying to work on this topic area a real increase of the considerations, at least around sexual and reproductive rights and health and gender in this space, and a lot of really good achievements. So I think we just need to continue with that and keep going. And there is a lot that has been achieved, but there's obviously a lot more to achieve too. I'll stop there.
Perfect. Thanks a lot. And I hear you about the critics on false solutions, and also the focus on more ethics and more human rights-based solutions. So thank you very much for that. So maybe Maria, you want to continue? You have to add something as well.
Yeah, really echoing what Heather was saying. We know this is the cup for finance, and we know this is the cup for adaptation. And at the same time, we know this is a very crucial cup for the climate movement to really push this narrative of where that finance is going to. Why? Because we have been more affected, because you have been more polluted. And really push this narrative of highlighting how there is this power dynamics, and there is this different responsibilities when it comes to who is more guilty for the climate crisis and who has been more affected. So definitely finance, especially climate finance and finance for loss and damage, is something that Fridays for Future and a big part of the climate movement, it's going to be pushing for. But there are many details into this conversation, and I feel like, you know, they say the devil is in the details, and that's really what we need to look at. Because why is it useful for us that, you know, global north countries come together, they pull a lot of money, and if it comes to how are you going to use that money for adaptation and mitigating the climate crisis in Mexico, we don't want that to go to the Mexican government. They're very corrupt, and they are militarizing the country. And so we know that any money that comes to the hands of the Mexican government, it's gonna end up there. They're gonna find an argument to make it look like, oh, climate change is a national security issue, so we need more military and police in the streets. We don't want that. We want less intermediaries between the people who have the money and the communities who need the money to take the solutions on ground. And that's a very, very interesting conversation. How can rural and indigenous communities access this finance without so many intermediaries, without so much bureaucracy, and on a way that is actually useful for them? That's something that is so important. Money is going to be useless if it's only for fulfilling or like checking a box. If it's only for fulfilling like a treaty. It needs to actually reach the people who need it and who know how to use it. And definitely, like, this conversation of false solutions, it's something that we're very, very interested on. Last COP, the Mexican government was very famous because they were selling these carbon credits to make these reforestation programs in the south of the country and in Guatemala as well. And people who are there, they're being evicted from their territories because someone paid the Mexican government to, you know, reduce emissions through that. And that's something we really need to like evidence and visibilize. Like, it's not only about giving money away. It's looking at the details of how that money is being used, and definitely accountability is such an important part of the discussion. Yeah.
Thank you, Maria. Actually, we are really almost right now at the end. We arrived at the end of our session. It is 3 o'clock, but I think this discussion is so interesting. I would have loved to continue for much longer. Just because we haven't had a look at the Mentimeter result, I would just propose that we have a quick look at it. Maybe if you have time for a few more minutes, then we can all look at it together. That would be really great. So actually we do see a few of the topics that you mentioned as well. So loss and damages here, global goal on adaptation, climate finance, all really important: climate justice, feminist climate action, a feminist approach, also about displacement, really important topics also from the audience. So thank you very much for participating also from the audience. And well, I don't know, I did cut you off a little bit with your final statements for COP, so I will ask you if anybody of you three wants to give us a last final statement, maybe that you want the audience to hear, then I would give you the place, and please be short because we are already running over time. Thank you. Who would like, Maria, would you like to say something more? Then please go on.
Yeah, definitely. If you're interested in COP and you're looking at COP, please don't only look at the discussions, also look at the human rights situation in Egypt, and especially look at it after COP. We're so worried about the impacts that the discussions and the protests and the conversations are going to have over activists and people that are going to stay in the region after that. When we talk about the climate crisis, we need to talk about human rights, because the climate crisis, it's a humanitarian issue. So please research about that, Google about the human rights situation in Egypt, visualize the situation. And for the media specifically, please also, keep on the look Egyptian activists and people that are going to stay on the ground after COP.
Thanks, Maria. Anybody else? Heather or Dr. Asha, would you like to say something final? Okay. Well then, thanks a lot to all the three of you. Thank you, Maria Reyes. Thank you, Dr. Asha Mohammed. Thank you, Dr. Heather McMullen. You were great. Thanks so much for your time and for your dedication, for your work, for your engagement. It is great. Really happy to have you here, to have had you here. It was a great discussion for me, at least. I hope for the audience as well. Just a quick information for the Humanitarian Congress. There's another session, the last session, if I understand it right, from the Humanitarian Congress. It is starting in now 27 minutes. It is on the global food crisis, and yeah, you can find more information on the website, and I think it is actually also in the chat already. So thank you very, very much. If you have any more questions, please write to the Humanitarian Congress Berlin. And well, again, Maria, Dr. Asha, Dr. Heather, thanks a lot, and have a great day, and good luck for COP27. Bye-bye.